I've come to Eastbourne to discover how two friends chose to die side by side and how the sinking left a family torn apart. This is the story of the Titanic band. Now, we might think we know it well. As the ship went down, 8 brave musicians played on. But that was only the start of the story.
All the musicians died, but of course their stories lived on. And for the family of one, his heroic death led to a tale of jealousy, bitterness and greed.
His name was Jock Hume, but my connection to him is through one of his best mates on Titanic, John Woodward. John was a cellist at the Grand Hotel Eastbourne, and like him, I used to perform there. Not as a musician, but as a dancer.
Oh yes, yes. This is the place. It's the early 70s. I'm young, I'm 25 years old. My hair is dark. And I used to come here for special functions. And we would be the cabaret, my wife and I, dancing, ballroom dancing. And I've got to say, the place hasn't changed at all. And I'm sure the place hasn't changed since dear old John Woodward was here back in the early 1900s.
John Woodward played next door to the ballroom in the Great Hall. Today, that job is done by the Palm Court Strings Orchestra.
Do you think this environment would have been one that would have sort of helped him along?
Absolutely. If he played here, which I know he did, on this very spot, he couldn't have had a better learning curve for going on the Titanic. And it would have been a fantastic grounding for playing while people are talking, while people are having tea.
And was there great camaraderie, do you think, between all the musicians?
I don't think they could have gone off on these long trips, you know, and not be close. It would have been a nightmare for them if they had. You know, I think they probably were really good friends.
In search of adventure, John left Eastbourne and signed up with the White Star Line. He got a job playing on Titanic, and it cost him his young life. There's a memorial to John at the bandstand on the seafront at Eastbourne.
John Wesley Woodward, a member of the Eastbourne Municipal Orchestra and the Grand Hotel Eastbourne Orchestra. And it goes on to say how he died on the Titanic in 1912, faithful unto death. And when you see a thing like this, it makes you appreciate the bravery of these guys. These guys weren't big, tough soldiers or sailors. They were musicians, and yet they stayed with the ship until it went down. John's story is tragic, but there is another story just as sad, about another musician, one of his closest friends, somebody that he played beside and died beside.
Jock Hume was from Dumfries. He was in love with a girl, but his father didn't approve, and an angry feud erupted. Jock turned his back on his dad and took a job at White Star to build a life for himself and Mary.
Then, the week before Jock was to commence his work on the Titanic, Mary discovered she was pregnant. Jock was delighted and promised that when he returned, they would be married.
Every night, Jock and the band entertained the first-class passengers in the luxurious restaurant, and that's where they were when Titanic struck the iceberg.
As the diners went up onto deck, the band followed them into the cold night air and continued to play as commotion turned into chaos.
In the midst of it all, the band struck up. The story goes that the last tune they played was Nearer My God to Thee. There were over 2,200 people on Titanic and lifeboat places for just 1,180. It was certain hundreds would die. As they played, it must have become clear to the band how it would all end. But rather than fight for a place in the lifeboat, Jock and his friends played on to their deaths. Titanic left Mary grief-stricken. Worse, it left her unmarried and pregnant with a child with no father. A desperate position for a woman in 1912. So she turned to Jock's father, Andrew. He couldn't have given her a colder reception. Yvonne Hume is Andrew's great-granddaughter.
He just couldn't bear the thought of Mary and her unborn child. It was as simple as that. He did not accept her existence. His son was his and no one else's. And he slammed the door in her face.
A special fund was set up to compensate the families of Titanic victims. So Mary applied for help. But Jock's father was determined to deny her.
Andrew also applied to the relief fund because as far as he was concerned, Mary was not entitled to that money. It was for him to have to stop her from getting it.
The dispute was settled in court and Mary received the money she was entitled to. But the family rift never healed. And for 100 years, one side of the family was entirely lost to the other. Yvonne had no idea what happened to the daughter of her great-uncle Jock until she looked into her family history.
A letter came through the door, and it was from a long-lost cousin. I'm Jock Hume's grandson. I wondered if you'd like to meet up and compare notes. Well, we met, and this is how I found everything out.
The Titanic disaster broke up the family for 100 years, and lonely now is Yvonne getting to know the cousins she never knew she had.
The tale of Jock Hume, his father, his fiancée and his child shows us that 100 years later, tales from the Titanic can still surprise us. And the sinking wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of hundreds more.